don't forget to smash the like button and share this video with as many people as you can. And if you have not subscribed to my channel yet, do it. And press the notification bell too so that you don't miss any of my videos. So without any delay, let's get started. And today we are going to do JavaScript forms. So this will be a new topic. We have completed all the versions and now we are shifting to forms. So we will do 2 chapters and today we will complete the whole JavaScript forms. So I'm very excited for it. Are you? Let's get started. Tab. So I'll go to Google Chrome and then I'll open WC Schools. Just a second. Yeah. Now I'll learn JavaScript, and in that I'm going to the JS forms. I'll just do full screen. So JavaScript forms. So JavaScript form validation. HTML form validation can be done by JavaScript. HTML form validation. So we make forms in HTML, but we can validate them in JavaScript. If a form field f name is empty, so if a form field is empty, this function alerts a message and returns false to prevent the form being submitted. So what this function does, if the form field is empty, so if somebody does not fill anything in the form field and just presses submit, this function will alert a message and returns false to prevent the form being from submitted. So here's the function. We are doing function validate form. Variable x is equal to document.forms, my form fname.value. So I'll explain everything. If x is equal to empty string, alert name must be filled out and return false. So I'll just explain down over here when we'll run the code. The function can be called with when the form is submitted. So on submit we can call it. So I'll explain several things in this. First of all, I will explain what does this function do. So over here in this over here, we have created a form. Okay, in that we are given an input field. Okay, its type will be text, so we can add text to it. Its name is fname. So we if we want to access the input field in its name we are setting its name to fname. Then we are doing input type submit, value submit. So this is creating the submit button. Okay, and in the form we are doing name is equal to my form. So we are giving its name my form, and we are doing action is equal to action page.php. So this has a predefined file named action page.php, and whenever we press submit, it will go to action page.php. We are doing on submit. Whenever it will submit, it will do return validate form. I'll just explain why are we doing return. First we so like it will call validate form, and then the method of going in the information going is post method. So we will learn more about post methods in our further videos, but right now let's focus on this in validation. So in this function, what it is doing, it is making a variable x and it is accessing the fname input's value. So whatever the value will be of the fname's input, like we are doing document.forms, my form, so it will go to my form, it will bring fname's value. So it is bringing fname value. So whatever we have entered, when we submit, the value of this text input field would come in this variable. We could also have done it the same thing. We could have done it with no brackets and no quotes, with dot notation. So it would have still worked. It would still have worked. Okay. So if x is equals to empty string, it will allowed name must be filled out and it will return false. So if I'll do this and then I submit, it is working fine. But if I give submitted empty, if it is empty and I submit, it will show me name must be filled out. Now this is quite obvious, but you must be thinking that we never give return in whenever we are calling a function. Before it we don't give return. So why are we giving return right now? So we are giving return right now because if we don't give return, it will not stop the form for submitting. It will allow this, but if we don't give return, it will not stop the form from submitting. So I'll just show you what I mean. I run this and then I press submit. Name must be filled out is coming, and then it has submitted. It has submitted the form also, but with return, it is not submitting the form. It will not submit the form because over here false is getting returned, and if false is getting returned over here also on submit also, if false is returned, then this form will stop submitting. But if from validate form, if we don't give return, only false will come over here, and that will mean nothing. So it will continue the submitting of the form. So it would be like instead when we leave it so like when we submit it empty, it would be when we submit it, it would be equal to like this. So it is the same thing, and this does not mean anything, right? This does not mean anything. So it will continue like submitting. That's why. So basically, without return, it will continue submitting the form. If the value is false, then also if the value is false, then also it will continue submitting the form. In true value, it submits the form, but in false value, it stop submitting the form. But we will have to give return. We will have to give return, else false does not mean anything to it, and it will continue submitting. So that's why it is important. So I told you about dot notation, and now I have told you about this also. So this is how we can simply validate that if the input field value is empty, then it will show us this alert. So it will show us this alert and it will stop the form submitting. Okay, JavaScript can validate numeric input. JavaScript is often used to validate numeric input. So it is not explaining how we can validate, but when we will try it, I will explain you the code. So please input a number between 1 and 10. If I give 5, submit. Input is okay, but if I give like 0, not valid. So let's see how it is doing. Over here, it is creating an input field. So we are creating an input field. Then we are creating a button, and on click. So whenever this button will be clicked, the my function method will be called, and the button's name will be submit. So what are we doing in my function? We are making two variables, x and text. In x we are bringing this input field's value. So whenever the submit button will be pressed, this value that we give over here will come in the variable x. Then it will check that is nan x. What is nan x is doing? Is nan x is checking that if x value is nan, that means nan means not a number. So if we give GTHFHH, this is not a number, so it will is nan x will give true. Okay, so if nan is nan x or x is less than 1 or x is greater than 10, text is equal to input not valid. So we don't we want a number. We want to validate the form like this, so that like we want a number between 1 and 10. So how can we get it? We don't want a number. We don't want x, this value. We don't want this value to be not a number. It should be a number. We want that number to be greater than 1. Okay, and we want that number to be less than 10. Then only it will give input okay, else it will give input not valid. So this is not valid input. This is also not valid input, but this is a valid input because it is between 1 and 10. So I hope you understood how we are bringing a number, how we are validating a number from 1 and 10, between 1 and 10. How we are checking that the number is between 1 and 10. Okay, so now we are on automatic HTML form validation. So HTML form validation can be performed automatically by the browser also. So it can be performed automatically by the browser also. How? Let's see. If a form field f name is empty, so if the form field is empty, the required attribute prevents this form from being submitted. So what the required attribute does is that it does not let the form field be empty. It always has to be something. So if we submit it, like if it is empty and we submit it, it will show us please fill in this field. This is coming because of the required attribute. If we remove this, and if we submit it like this, it would go over there. Okay, so required always wants the form not to be empty. There should be some value in every input field. So we can ensure that with the required. Automatic HTML form validation does not work in Internet Explorer 9 or earlier. Okay. So data validation. Data validation is the process of ensuring that user input is clean, correct, and useful. So data validation is a process of ensuring that user input is clean, correct, and useful. Typical validation tasks are: has the user filled in the required fields? So we should for data validation, we are typical validation tasks are: has the user filled in all required fields? So we need to check, has the user filled in all the required fields? Then we need to check, has the user entered a valid date or data? Has the user entered a valid data? So whatever the data we are requesting, has the user entered that type of data or some other type of data? This is the second point. And the third point is, has the user entered text in a numeric field? So we need to check, has the user entered ABC in a numeric field, or has the user entered So most often the purpose of data validation is to ensure correct user input. Most often the purpose of data validation is to ensure correct user input. Validation can be defined by many different methods and developed in many different ways. So validation can be defined by many different methods and deployed in many different ways. So in server-side validation is performed by a web server. So server-side validation is performed by a web server on the web server after input has been sent to the server. So after input has been sent to the server validates. In server validation, server-side validation is performed by a web server. So server-side validation is performed by a web server after input has been sent to the server. So after the input has been sent to the server-side validation starts. Client-side validation is performed by a web browser. So a web browser does client-side validation before input is sent to the web server. So before input is sent to the web server, all the client-side validation is performed. Okay. Now we are on HTML constraint validation. HTML5 introduced a new HTML validation concept called constraint validation. So HTML validation concept introduced a new HTML. So HTML5 introduced a new HTML validation concept called constraint validation. HTML constraint validation is based on constraint validation HTML input attributes. So the input attributes, HTML input attributes, constraint validation CSS pseudo selectors. So the CSS pseudo selectors, we will get to know about these further. Constraint validation DOM properties and methods. So DOM properties and methods. So let's revise this. Constraint validation of HTML input attributes, constraint validation CSS pseudo selectors, and constraint validation DOM properties and methods. Constraint validation HTML input attributes. So the attributes are disabled, max, min, pattern, and required and type. So the disabled attribute specifies that the input element should be disabled. So this the disabled attribute specifies that the input element should be disabled. The max attribute specifies the maximum value as an input of an input element. The min attribute specifies the minimum value of an input element. The pattern attribute specifies the value pattern of an input element. Required attribute specifies that the input field requires an element. So we tested how required works. We tried to work with required and we did work with required over here in this example. In automatic HTML form validation, we work with required also. And finally, type specifies the type of an input element. For a full list, go to HTML input attributes. So we will see the full list of HTML input attributes when we will do HTML. But let's stick with JavaScript right now. Now we are on constraint validation CSS pseudo selectors. So the selectors are disabled, invalid, optional, required, and valid. So disabled selects input elements with the disabled attribute specified. So the disabled selects input elements with the disabled attribute specified. Invalid selects the input elements with invalid values. Optional selects input elements with no required attribute specified. So if there is no required attribute specified, optional selects that input element. Required selects input elements with the required attribute specified. And finally, valid selects input elements with valid values. For a full list, go to CSS pseudo classes. We will go to CSS pseudo classes when we will do CSS. Let's stick to JavaScript right now. This chapter is done. Now we are doing Forms API. Constraint validation DOM methods. So there are two constraint validation DOM methods. One is check validity and the other one is set custom validity. Check validity returns true if an input element contains valid data. So if an input element contains valid data, then check validity will return true. And set custom validity sets the validation message property of an input element. So we will learn about validation message in this chapter only right now. But let's see what does set custom validity do. Set custom validity sets the validation message property of an input element. Okay, so it sets the validation message. So validation message is the message that will be showed to validate. So like if there is an error in the input given by the user, the validation message is executed, and you can say you can make your own custom validation message with the set custom validity method. Okay, so if an input field contains invalid data, display a message. So what this is doing, it is creating an input field. Its minimum value should be 100 and its maximum value should be 300, and it is required. So if I press OK like this, please fill in this field. This is a predefined message because we are not setting it. It is coming by itself, validation. So let's see this. But we are making a button OK, and it on whenever it will be clicked, my function will be called. In my function, we are making a variable named input object. In that we are doing document.getElement by id1. So we are bringing this element. So in that we are checking if not input object dot check validity. So if it is not valid, so through the statement we are checking. So if input object is not valid, then document.getElement by id demo. So over here we created a demo key tag. Inner HTML, so we will print whatever we give over here using the inner HTML. Input object dot validation message. So by input object dot validation message, we are bringing a validation message that will be displayed so that the user knows what error he has done, what things he has not done according to the rules of the input field. Else document.getElement by id demo dot in HTML input OK. So if a number should be from between 100 and 300. If we give like 400, like 444, then and we press OK, value must be less than or equal to 300. So this validation message property is producing this message itself. We are not producing it anywhere, it is producing it itself. So you see, so like this is so good. The predefined validation is so good, right? So if I give like ABC, we so like if I give this empty, then also it will show please fill in this field. If I give it less than 100, so like 20, then also it will show value must be greater than or equals to 100. So this is the power of like these all predefined properties and all. You don't need to do anything. Like type of you don't need to do anything. It does everything by itself. Now we are on constraint validation DOM properties. So some properties are validity, validation message, and will validate. So we have already used validation message property. So let's see what does validity do. Validity contains Boolean properties related to the validity of an input element. So validity contains Boolean properties related to the validity of an input element. So validation message contains the message of a browser will display when the validity is false. So when validity is false, the validation message contains the message a browser will display. So the validation message, when the validity will be false, the validation message will be executed. Will validate. Finally, will validate indicates if an input element will be validated. So will validate shows that an input element will be validated or not. Validity properties. The validity properties of an input element contains a number of properties related to So we did validity over here. These are constrained DOM properties: validity, validation, message, and will validate. And in validity also there are properties like custom error, pattern mismatch, range overflow, range underflow, step mismatch, too long, type mismatch, value missing, and valid. So let's see what all these properties do. Custom error set to true if a custom validity message is set. So if there is a validity message is set, it will be set to true. Pattern mismatch sets to true if an element's value does not match its pattern attribute. So pattern mismatch sets to true if an element's value does not match its pattern attribute. Range overflow sets to true if an element's value is greater than its max attribute. Range underflow is set to true if an element's value is less than its min attribute. Step mismatch sets to true if an element's value is invalid per its step attribute. Too long is set to true if an element's value exceeds its max length attribute. Type mismatch set to true if an element's value is invalid per its type attribute. Value missing sets to true if an element with a required attribute has no value. So it sets to true if an element with a required attribute has no value. And valid attribute sets to true if an element's value is valid. So some examples are: if the number is an input field is greater than 100, the input max attribute display a message. So over here we have an input field, here we have a button, and then on its on click we are calling my function. In my function we have a variable txt and its value is empty string. If document.get element by id1 dot validity dot range overflow, so we are checking that it is true or not. So like if range is like if we are given a number, it is checking that a number is greater than 100 or not. If yes, it will show value too large. If this statement returns true, it will mean that the value we have given is too large, and it will do txt is equal to value too large. Else it will like it will print input okay. So if I give like a value greater than 100, it will show value too large. But if I give a number less than 100 like 3, it will do input okay, because we are not checking for range underflow, we are checking for range overflow, and there is no min attribute also, so range underflow will do nothing over here. So if the number is in an input field is less than 100, the input's min attribute display a message. So as I told you, we are using range underflow over here. We are doing the same thing, but for range we are checking that range is for, we are doing it with the min thing. Like if minimum value is 100, if it is less than 100, if this statement is true, that will mean that the value is less than 100, and it will show value too small. So if I give 67 for instance, press OK, it will show value too small. Okay, and the chapter is done. So thank you guys. If you like the video, don't forget to smash the like button and share this video with as many people as you can. And if you have not subscribed to my channel yet, do it, and press the notification bell too, so that you don't miss any of my videos. Thank you guys. Bye. Stay safe, stay healthy, and keep watching my videos. Bro.